Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dalton Jenkins, and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on Chapter 38 of our textbook, which is titled Angiosperm Reproduction and Biotechnology. Let's talk about the angiosperm life cycle first. Seed plants are classified as angiosperms if they produce flowers, which are reproductive structures or fruiting bodies inside which seeds are developed. Flowers can be broken down into different parts known as floral organs. The first of which we'll talk about are the sepals, right, as you can see right here on this diagram. They are a protective covering that surrounds the flower before it opens up, so whenever it's still budding. The next floral organ we'll discuss are the petals, which are what you think of typically when you think of a flower. They're brightly colored, modified leaves, and they serve to attract insects or other animal pollinators. All seed plants, including angiosperms, are heterosporous, and their flowers have two distinct kinds of sporophylls. You have microsporophylls, which produce microspores that become male gametophytes, and those microspores are called stamens. That is another of the floral organs, as you can see right here. Angiosperms also have megasporophylls, which produce megaspores that become female gametophytes, floral organ known as the carpel. The stamen is comprised of two parts, the filament and the anther. The filament is a sort of trunk, and the anther is a sac at the end that is responsible for the production of pollen. The carpel, it's also commonly called the pistil, as you can see here, and it can be broken down into three parts. The stigma, which is a sticky tip that collects pollen and funnels it into the stalk-like structure known as the style, which delivers the pollen to the ovary to fertilize the ovules within. Flowers can be classified as either complete flowers or incomplete flowers. Complete flowers are flowers that have all four of the floral organs we've just mentioned: the petal, the stamen, the carpel, and the sepal. Incomplete flowers are missing at least one of the floral organs. And some flowers, such as sunflowers, present themselves as these sort of flamboyant arrangements called inflorescence, which are comprised of many incomplete flowers. Move on to discussing methods of pollination. Pollination is a process that occurs when a pollen grain from a seed plant is transported by some mechanism, whether it is wind or an animal pollinator, to the ovule of a seed plant. Let's talk about the development of gametophytes. Megasporangia produce megaspores, which will always develop into female gametophytes, and in angiosperms, the female gametophytes develop into embryo sacs that contain egg cells inside of each ovule. Microspores are produced by microsporangia and will always develop into a male gametophyte, which will develop into a pollen grain, which serves to fertilize the ovules. When a pollen grain is delivered to a receptive stigma, this structure right here, it germinates and produces a structure known as a pollen tube, which delivers two sperm cells to the female gametophyte, where double fertilization will occur. Now, what is double fertilization? Double fertilization, as seen in angiosperms, is a reproductive mechanism that is exclusive to angiosperms. Different forms of double fertilization can occur in other plants, but the process of double fertilization that we are specifically talking about here is exclusive to angiosperm. And in double fertilization in angiosperms, one sperm cell received by the ovule fertilizes the egg and develops into a zygote, whilst the other sperm cell fertilizes two nuclei within the embryo sac and forms a triploid cell, which will become endosperm, which is a food storing tissue found in a seed that will serve to nourish the angiosperm embryo as it develops. And that brings us to our next point, seed development and structure. So what are seeds? Seeds are the embryos of plants that are nestled inside a safeguarding shell that is formed from the integuments of the ovule after fertilization, and it is known as the seed coat. The seed is packed with essential nutrients similar to the eggs of animal species that lay them externally rather than animal species that develop their embryos within their bodies. Furthermore, near the end of the maturation of the seed, it will enter a state known as dormancy, in which it stops growing and its metabolic activity will nearly cease. Endosperm is a food storing tissue found in a seed that will serve to nourish the angiosperm embryo as it develops, and it is, like the embryo, a product of double fertilization, and it begins its development sooner than the embryo itself does. Humans eat the endosperm of many plants, including grains, coconuts, and popcorn. Talk about the development of embryos. The first cell division undergone by a zygote splits it into a terminal cell and a basal cell. The basal cell will undergo a subsequent series of cell divisions and become a structure known as the suspensor, which fastens the embryo to the parent plant and transfers nutrients to the embryo from the plant. And the terminal cell will continue to divide and develop into a spherically shaped proembryo that will eventually become an embryo. Let's move on to sporophyte development. Let's talk about seed germination. So imbibition is the process by which the germination of dormant seeds is kickstarted, and it's caused by the uptake of water by the dry seed, which has a low water potential. The seed will swell with water and cause the seed coat to burst, and this will bring about the end of the dormant stage. And finally, the root will then emerge, followed by the shoot if there is an adequate supply of water. Post-germination, seeds devote their energy to maximizing vegetative growth before the reproductive stage of their life cycles begin. And flowering begins when a plant is exposed to environmental stimuli and internal signals based on an internal clock. And finally, on this, talking about the life cycle of angiosperms, let's talk about the structure and function of fruit. Just as seeds develop within a fertilized angiosperm ovule, the ovaries also undergo a developmental change and begin to form fruits that protect the angiosperm seeds and usually facilitate their dispersal in some way. Some fruits develop specialized traits for wind dispersal or dispersal by animals. Simple fruits are fruits that are the result of a lone carpel or a group of carpels fused together. Aggregate fruits, like raspberries, are fruits that are the result of multiple separate carpels belonging to a single flower, each forming a small fruitlet of its own. And multiple fruits, such as pineapples, are fruits that are results of an inflorescence forming a single fruit together. Brings us to our next slide, reproduction of angiosperms. So what is asexual reproduction? It's a term that refers to the reproductive mechanisms by which a genetically identical offspring is produced by a single parent without the need for fertilization. Some mechanisms of asexual reproduction that we see in angiosperms are fragmentation. It's a mechanism of asexual reproduction by which the parent organism is divided into many different parts that are each capable of producing an entirely new organism on their own if cut off. Apomixis is a mechanism of asexual reproduction by which the parent organism is able to produce seeds, which comes with the benefit of seed dispersal without the need for fertilization or even the production of sperm and egg cells at all. And we have vegetative reproduction, which refers to the mechanisms of asexual reproduction in plants that are based around vegetative growth. If vegetative reproduction in plants is influenced in some way by humans, that process is now known as vegetative propagation. Angiosperms also reproduce sexually, and both sexual and asexual reproductive mechanisms have their respective advantages. Some advantages for asexual reproduction: there's no need for pollination. Plants can pass along their entire set of genetic information, which can be advantageous if a plant is very well suited for its environment. It will produce offspring that are very well suited for its environment and have a high chance of success. And finally, plants produced through vegetative reproduction are generally more successful than those that grow from seeds produced from sexual reproduction, because they get to skip the germination phase, which is a phase that not many young plants live to see the end of. And some advantages of sexual reproduction: it promotes genetic diversity within populations, which decreases a species' risk of extinction and increases its resistance to infections and often changing conditions. Seeds are usually produced through sexual reproductive mechanisms, and they can be dispersed further. So the production of seeds allows for a wider range of dispersal. And seed dormancy allows the seed to survive harsh conditions and continue to grow again when conditions improve. Now, self-fertilization can be a problem for some plants, and let's talk about some of the mechanisms that angiosperms have to prevent this. As I've mentioned before, one main advantage of sexual reproduction is the promotion of genetic diversity by combining two different sets of genetic information. So Many plants will prevent self-fertilization. One such method of preventing self-fertilization is self-incompatibility, which is the ability of a plant to recognize and reject pollen that originated from itself or individuals that are very closely related to it. Plants have other mechanisms by which they prevent self-fertilization, such as some plants only produce either stamens or carpels. Some will produce both, but not at the same time, or some will produce both that are physically arranged in a way where it's very unlikely that they will pollinate themselves. I have some images here. You can see some species, they only produce staminate flowers or carpelate flowers, so they will not produce both. This species, known as Oxalis alpina, they produce two types of flowers on different individuals, which have short styles and long stamens, or long styles and short stamens. An insect foraging for nectar would collect pollen on different parts of its body. Thrown pollen would be deposited on pin stigmas and vice versa. Let's talk about genetically modified crops. Our first point is plant breeding. Plant breeding is the process by which breeders manipulate the plants they grow into presenting specific traits or characteristics by messing with their genetic information. Wild plant species are often crossed with domesticated plant species over and over again until an offspring with the desirable characteristics from both species is created. So this crossing has to happen multiple times in most cases, because the first few times you may get the advantageous characteristics from one species, but the disadvantageous characteristics from another. So it usually takes multiple tries to find the perfect balance. Transgenes are involved in this process. These are genes that are transferred from one organism to another, and they contribute to hybridization and genetic diversity. Let's talk about genetic engineering. Our first point being world hunger, which is a problem that worsens as the human population continues to grow, but genetic engineering of food crops may help increase food production to help with this issue. And genetic engineering can also help with fossil fuel dependency, which we know fossil fuels are a very limited resource. Biofuels are potentially carbon neutral fuel sources that come from plant biomass, and could potentially satisfy a significant portion of energy needs worldwide. But biotechnology is often met with controversy. There's concerns regarding human health, such as people who oppose the genetic modification of food crops. They worry that allergens may be transferred to a species that did not produce them before, thus harming humans who eat them. There's no credible evidence for this claim, however, and in fact, it seems that many genetically modified food crops are healthier to consume than non-genetically modified ones. Genetically modified crops also, some of them also require less pesticides, which is healthier for the workers who grow them because it reduces the amount of harsh chemicals they are exposed to. There's also concerns regarding non-target organisms. Detractors are concerned that the genetic modification of food crops could potentially pose problems for other organisms that interact with the crops. And the final controversy that we'll talk about regarding biotechnology is transgene escape. So some believe that the use of genetically modified food crops opens up the possibility for transgenes to be transferred to a harmful plant species, and this transgene could encode for some sort of advantageous characteristic that makes them more difficult to manage or get rid of. And here I have an image of non-genetically modified maize and genetically modified maize. You can see the genetically modified one looks much healthier. Field trials reveal that non-genetically modified maize is heavily damaged by insects and mold, whereas the one on the right suffers little to no damage because it has been genetically modified to present a characteristic that prevents it from being fed upon by insects. And that is all I have for today. Thank you for listening and have a great day.